Welcome back, everyone. No intro this time. If you're not sure what we're doing here, I highly advise watching part 1. We're going to jump right into it. Let's dive down to Tier 4 of the Project Apollo Iceberg. The Genesis readings and Lunar Communion. Perhaps better remembered in certain communities, like, religious communities, are the two significant moments of Christianity to occur during the Apollo program. In part 1, we discussed the microfiche lunar Bibles, but did you also know that Apollo 8 did a reading from Genesis while orbiting the moon? Almost all of the Apollo astronauts were very public about their devout faith, and the Apollo 8 crew decided to symbolically take the religion further than it had ever gone before by transmitting this audio to Earth on Christmas Eve, 1968.
The crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day.
God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Then with Apollo 11, Christianity took yet another step into the cosmos when Buzz Aldrin was on the moon the next year. However, by this time, NASA had received an amount of pushback from the public due to the Genesis readings on Apollo 8. People felt uncomfortable by it, believing it to be somewhat in conflict with the First Amendment, which relates to government influence in regards to religion and religious expression. In fact, the organization American Atheists went so far as to sue the United States government for a violation of the First Amendment, though the case was dismissed. As a result of the tension of the subject, Buzz was very quiet about the fact that he took Holy Communion while on the surface of the moon. In the downtime period between landing and stepping out of the LEM, while the two were preparing for a moment they knew would go down in history, Buzz Aldrin was casually and quietly producing a small amount of wine and a chalice given to him by his local church. He poured the wine, noting the way the liquid curled slowly around the rim of the cup in the moon's low gravity. He quietly read some scripture, drank the wine, and ate a communion wafer, while Armstrong watched but did not participate. They then continued to prepare for their historic moonwalk without the public having known that anything had happened, though some news outlets had reported that Aldrin planned to bring communion bread to the moon. Apollo 12's broken TV camera. If you saw the previous video, and I hope you did, you might have noticed that there wasn't much footage from Apollo 12's moonwalk. Lots from 11, 14, 15, 16, and 17, but not 12. There's lots to say about the launch, and lots of photos, especially involving the Surveyor spacecraft, but not a lot of video. That's because they broke the TV camera. Apollo 12 was the first landing mission to use a color camera, a portable RCA TV camera. Alan Bean, after stepping onto the lunar surface and retrieving it from his mount on the lander, carried the camera to a spot where he could set it up for a wider shot. However, as he did so, he accidentally pointed the lens of the camera straight at the sun, which immediately burned out and destroyed the secondary electron conduction tube. The feed was lost completely, and as a result, television coverage of the mission quickly ceased.
Camera it off.
Hey, Al, we have a pretty bright image on that TV. Could you either move it or stop it down?
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it down. That's as far as it goes, Houston. How does that look to you?
No, it still is the same, Al. Why don't you try shifting the scene?
Apollo 12 continued as planned, performing several interesting experiments and retrieving pieces of the Surveyor 3 probe, However, unlike the other missions, nobody saw any of it until they got home and developed the film photographs. The curious case of the Apollo 11 seating arrangement. Generally speaking, at launch, all Apollo missions had specific spots for each crew member to sit in. The command module pilot was in the center, the lunar module pilot on the right, and the commander on the left. However, for Apollo 11, lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin sat center, command module pilot Collins sat on the right, and Commander Armstrong on the left. So why the change? Well, it's sort of a long story. Michael Collins had been, at one point, command module pilot for the prime crew of Apollo 8. However, in July of 1968, Collins suffered a cervical disc herniation which required surgery to fix. As a result, he was replaced on the crew of Apollo 8 by Jim Lovell. Once Collins was back in shape, he was actually something of a late addition to the crew of Apollo 11, and at the time, Buzz Aldrin had been trained for the center seat, being backup CMP for Apollo 8. So Collins simply learned what he needed to know to fly the right-hand seat for launch, while Buzz stayed in the position that he already knew best. Not that it would matter much past launch, because everybody pretty much sat where they wanted to at that point. Alright, let me just try and say this with a straight face. The Apollo 10 floating turd. Oh boy. Let's set the scene. Apollo 10, crewed by Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Eugene Cernan, is in lunar orbit. The crew is making preparations to burn away from the moon and begin the return journey home. When suddenly, well, let's just read the transcript. "Oh, who did it?" asks Stafford. "Who did what?" Young asks. "What?" Cernan also asks. "Who did it?" Stafford repeats, laughing. "Where did that come from?" Cernan asks, as they spy the mysterious floating feces aboard their spacecraft. None of the crew members believed they were responsible for it as they continued to dodge the turd and find something to grab it with and stow it in a trash bag. On more than one occasion, Stafford insisted that it wasn't his because his was, quote, stickier than that, and Cernan points out that it didn't match the consistency he had noticed when he stuck his finger into his own. Yeah, they get into some really gross details as they try to figure out who did the deed, and the best part? They never did reach a conclusion. Someone had failed to seal the bag that was attached to their buttocks in their suit, and a piece had gotten out. Whose? How did they mess that up? Honestly, who knows? If you already saw the shuttle Iceberg, you'll know that poop in space is an unsettlingly common subject. Strolling on the moon. A little palate cleanser after the previous, sticky subject. The Fountain in the Park, otherwise known as While Strolling Through the Park One Day, is a pretty well-known song first published in 1884 by vaudeville actor Ed Haley. It's one of those songs everybody knows and has heard at some point or another, despite it not being that heavily featured in popular culture. Perhaps its most famous rendition was performed on Apollo 17, while Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan were walking on the moon toward a large patch of rocks. Let's listen.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Do-do-do-do-do. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great? Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. Dum-da-dum-dum-dum.
Nixon's other speeches. Boy, the tone of this video is a bit of a swinging pendulum, huh? President Nixon had prepared a speech written by one Bill Safire to be read in the event that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were stranded on the moon and unable to return to Earth. It's pretty intense, stating that, quote, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace," referring to their deaths as heroic sacrifices that brought humanity together and would continue to do so. It closes with, quote, "For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind." At the bottom of the so-named Sapphire memo, it states that Nixon should call the widows of the astronauts prior to making the speech. Below that, it also states that at the point NASA ceases communications with the astronauts, a clergyman should be present and operate as though a burial at sea were occurring, commending their souls to the deepest of the deep, and concluding with the Lord's Prayer. Thankfully, of course, this speech never had to be read. Now, here's the thing. At the time I made this Iceberg, I wrote speeches, plural. However, there were only 2 speeches prepared, and one is the speech that did happen when the mission was successful. However, my mama didn't raise no liars, so here's a satirical speech I found while searching. The astronauts have exploded. Hold for applause. The J missions. A lot of people don't realize that each Apollo landing mission had different goals based on the landing site and the equipment they had on them, as well as their progress through the program. A and B missions were unmanned test flights of spacecraft, C and D missions verified the CSM's capabilities and tested the lander, E missions never occurred, but record states that they would have been, quote, manned flight of the complete lunar landing mission vehicle in Earth orbit to great distances from Earth, effectively meaning flying everything almost to the moon and back. Apollo 8 effectively made this unnecessary by taking a CSM to lunar orbit with crew, so it was never flown. The F mission was Apollo 10, a dress rehearsal of lunar landing, and then G was Apollo 11, the first lunar landing. From there, H missions, Apollo 12, 13, and 14, were meant to demonstrate the LEM's ability to perform precision landings, and while Apollo 13 wasn't able to do that, Apollo 12 did it perfectly by landing within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 probe. Finally, the last class of mission, J missions, would perform proper scientific investigations over longer durations. Apollo 15 spent over 19 hours doing spacewalks on the lunar surface, compared to Apollo 11's 2.5-hour stay. By the end of the program, Apollo 17 was able to stay for 22 hours, and all 3 J missions would do extensive amounts of geology work on the moon's surface. The rovers used on these missions allowed for better and faster sample retrieval, and his television camera allowed geologists at home to participate in the crew's surveying work. The 3 canceled missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, would have also been J-type missions. The LLRV, and similarly the LLTV, perhaps the wackiest machines that NASA has ever flown in their entire history. Nicknamed the Flying Bedstead, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle was made by Bell Aerosystems in an effort to build a working simulator for the Apollo landings in real-world environments, and first flew in 1964. It's a pretty simple craft, with a wire frame, 4 landing legs, a seat for a pilot, and a singular General Electric turbofan mounted on a gimbal. Because it was expected that every lunar landing mission would require manual control on final descent, it was important that the pilots get a feel for what that would be like. To simulate that, the engine would lift the vehicle up to a test altitude and then throttle back to support 5/6 of the vehicle's weight, which would simulate the low gravity conditions of a descent on the moon. The pilot would use a set of 18 hydrogen peroxide thrusters to control their descent, allowing full control of pitch, yaw, and roll. The LLRV and later the improved lunar landing training vehicle were finicky and dangerous beasts at best. Of the 5 built, only 2 remain, as they had a tendency to, crash. Here's Neil Armstrong ejecting out of LLRV-1 at 200 feet in May of 1968 after a control problem. He was unharmed, but the vehicle was obviously lost, an event that grounded remaining flights until the improved LLTVs could be shipped to Ellington Air Force Base. The LLTV similarly crashed when test pilot Joe Algranti lost control in December of 1968. A flight readiness board was formed that included Mercury astronaut Deke Slayton, mission operations veteran Chris Kraft, and Maxime Fazet, who was responsible for the design of the Mercury spacecraft and was serving as director of engineering at Johnson. After reviewing wind tunnel results and making some changes to the enclosure around the pilot, the LLTV was cleared for resumption of test flights in March of 1969, all 18 of which would be successful, allowing for its use by every single lunar module pilot in the Apollo program at some point or another. Armstrong would later write that his training in the LLRV was key to the success of Apollo 11's landing, and that if he had never flown in it, he could never have made the landing. Oh, the third one to crash happened in 1971 when testing a major modification to its computer system. The pilot, Stuart Present, was unharmed. Capricorn 1. Here's our first mention of conspiracies about Apollo in this part of the iceberg. Capricorn 1 is a 1977 thriller film about a reporter uncovering a conspiracy involving the faking of a crewed mission to Mars. The film itself is pretty unremarkable, most critics found it lacking much style or substance, and it barely broke even upon release. What is more significant than the film itself is the role it plays in conspiracy theories. You see, the makers of Capricorn 1 decided that the best spacecraft to land on the planet Mars was the Apollo lunar lander. Like, they didn't change it at all, it's just a straight up mock-up of the LEM. Because, of course, if you're going to land on Mars, a planet with an atmosphere and around 0.38 Gs of gravity, you'd use the LEM, a vehicle specifically designed to fly in a vacuum, to a body with 0.16 Gs of gravity. So because of this very Hollywood decision, sort of like a movie where the space shuttle travels beyond low Earth orbit, you end up with footage of an Apollo LEM in a film studio. While the area surrounding it is colored to look like the surface of Mars, a bit of Photoshop work fixes that up pretty easily, especially since monochrome photos were very common in the Apollo era. Stills and short pieces of footage of Capricorn 1 have been picked up over time by Apollo hoaxers and often displayed online as behind-the-scenes footage of Apollo. A common instance of this claim is this post which claims that WikiLeaks has released the footage of the Apollo hoax. Of course, there is no such WikiLeaks page that makes this claim, and the footage is in fact a mashup of footage from Capricorn 1, footage from Apollo training, and actual Apollo moonwalk footage, with faked production audio over top of it. Use of Capricorn 1 for Apollo hoaxers is so common, in fact, that Bart Sibrel used it as the cover art for his film, in big quotes, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. Remember that name, Bart Sibrel. We'll come back to him. Oh, and one of the astronauts was played by O.J. Simpson. I feel like whenever I see his name in pop culture pre-1995, it feels like it's been deep-faked in there.
We don't want you in our town, Simpson. We don't love you like we did in 1993. Go!
Missing tapes. Keeping with the theme of conspiracies, this is a pretty big one. You might often see claims that use a lot of words interchangeably, stating that NASA lost all the moon landing footage or lost all of the Apollo data. But as usual, the truth is far more complicated and far less interesting than that. Did NASA lose something related to Apollo? Yep, they sure did. What exactly did they lose? Okay, take a seat. On Apollo 11, several reels of telemetry data tapes recorded the slow scan telecast or SSTV in its raw format during the broadcast. These data tapes were used to record the data for backup purposes. In order to even make the broadcast of the SSTV footage, NASA ground receiving stations had to perform a real-time scan conversion from the raw format to the NTSC television format, subsequently recording this on many other videotapes and kinescope films, while also broadcasting it around the world. Because the real-time broadcast was a success, and it was recorded elsewhere, these telemetry tape backup recordings of the raw format were considered pretty low priority in the years following the mission. As a result, at some point, they were lost. Went missing. Up in smoke. Gone. What happened to them? Don't really know. NASA only realized they were missing when several still photographs in the 1990s showed the visually superior raw SSTV transmission on one of the monitors in the ground stations, prompting a search for the data tapes. However, even after a multi-year investigation led by a research team of former NASA employees and contractors, they were never found. In fact, it's very likely that they were erased and reused in the early 1980s during a data tape shortage that the Landsat program was facing. Despite never finding the tapes and no longer having the equipment to play them back due to the technology being so outdated anyway, NASA did, however, manage to uncover higher quality NTSC videotapes as well as a Super 8 film taken of a video monitor in Australia that was playing the broadcast. As a result, despite the tapes being lost, there is no footage that was ever lost, no data that was ever lost, no telemetry that was ever lost. Just the raw data of a slightly better format that they've managed to meet and exceed in quality over the years anyway. S4B seismic testing. As mentioned previously, the third stage of the Saturn V, or S4B, was discarded after the lunar module was extracted from it by the CSM. Where would it go? Well, at first, discarded stages were sent into orbit of the Sun, leaving the Earth-Moon system completely and theoretically removing them as an orbital debris threat. We'll come back to that theoretically part. However, following Apollo 12, they had a new idea and began using the S4B as a scientific instrument. A new experiment was left on the lunar surface by the crew of Apollo 12, a passive seismometer experiment designed to detect vibrations on the lunar surface and use these to determine the internal structure of the moon. In addition to detecting moonquakes from within the moon, the experiment was also able to detect external sources of vibrations, such as a micrometeoroid crashing into it, or the spent third stage of a Saturn V. Following its deployment, every S4B that was sent to the moon was intentionally crashed into it, creating vibrations that the passive seismic experiment could measure. The first time this was done on Apollo 13, the stage crashed into the moon well after the oxygen tank incident, and when informed that the crash had occurred, Jim Lovell quipped, "Well, at least something went right on this mission." John Young's hot mic. Oh boy. John W. Young might be my favorite astronaut of all time. He is the only astronaut to have flown on Gemini, Apollo, and the space shuttle. He walked on the moon, snuck a corned beef sandwich into space, put Columbia's wheels on a runway for the very first time, and served as chief of the astronaut office for over a decade. His many achievements have left him with the modern internet moniker of the main character of spaceflight. During one of these achievements, a very human, very crude, and very funny moment occurred. Let's listen.
I'm at the ports again. I've got him again, Charlie. I haven't eaten this much citrus fruit in 20 years. And I'll tell you one thing, in another 12 fucking days, I ain't never eating any more. I put them up over the, right up in there. They ain't there? Oh, shit.
Orion, Houston.
Yes, sir.
Okay, John, where you have my hot mic?
How long we had that?
Apparently, the high fruit content of the Apollo astronaut diet wasn't agreeing with Young's stomach, and his announcement of the situation had been unintentionally broadcast live from the surface of the moon. There's been some debate as to the actual cause of the issue. Citrus fruit is actually less likely to give one gas than other fruits, though it is possible that some manner of artificial substitute in the food had caused it. Another possibility is tang, or rather the tang-like artificially flavored orange drinks that they were given, designed to be very high in potassium. Other astronauts throughout Apollo complained about the same issue. However, only one of them had the embarrassment of the entire world hearing about it live as it happened. Apollo subsatellites. Spaceflight loves ride-sharing. Payload designers have, over the years, gotten very good at making satellites very small and very lightweight, enough that one payload per launch system is often a case of overkill. Especially these days, it isn't uncommon for a single rocket to launch 2, 3, 4, or in the case of Starlink, over 20 satellites at a time. Artemis 1, launched in 2022, carried 10 small CubeSats inside the Orion stage adapter for deployment in lunar orbit. Project Apollo, similarly, was no stranger to ride-sharing. On Apollo 15, a subsatellite called the Apollo 15 Particles and Fields subsatellite was released out of the CSM's Scientific Instrument Module Bay, where it had been housed in a container resembling a mailbox. Designed around a hexagonal structure equipped with 3 instrument booms, the satellite was made to measure the strength and direction of cosmic magnetic fields, detect variations in the moon's gravity, and more. It was intended to operate for 1 year, and it fell short of this goal by 5 months after an electronics failure, but managed to accomplish all of its stated objectives anyway. Due to its success, the experiment was repeated on Apollo 16 with a virtually identical probe, though this one went a little differently. The CSM had problems with its service propulsion system, a subject we'll come back to, and as a result, the satellite was released in a very low lunar orbit of around 100 kilometers. The moon has an odd, uneven distribution of mass, making low orbits around it very unstable, meaning the second subsatellite crashed into the surface 34 days after the deployment. Nevertheless, it did manage to return some valuable data, especially about low altitudes, which at the time, there wasn't very much of. Apollo 15's nozzle damage. Not all of the Apollo landings touched down completely flawlessly, and Apollo 15 had a particularly bad one. Not only did the LEM touch down at a somewhat alarming angle of around 11 degrees, but the nozzle of the descent engine buckled inwards when the touchdown occurred at around 6 feet per second, faster than any other landing.
-1, 6% fuel. 10 feet, -1. 8 feet, -1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley.
It would seem that David Scott was a little fast on the engine stop command when the contact light came on. Because they were at the edge of a crater, the landing leg closest to the ground touched before the other 3, which may have also been a factor. While we can clearly see the bell nozzle buckled and damaged in photos, there's some debate as to how this actually happened. The most obvious answer would seem to be that the nozzle struck the lunar surface itself, but there is some discussion that suggests the damage occurred from overpressure, basically the engine's exhaust hitting the ground and then bouncing back up into the nozzle. However, while it looks bad and it was probably a little unnerving, this hard landing and subsequent damage posed no difficulty to Apollo 15, as it was able to lift off and return home without any issue. Moon trash. Yeah, there's trash on the moon. Are you really surprised? Remember, spaceflight is all about saving weight. So after you've spent a few days flying to the moon, what do you do when you get there? All the food containers, food waste, and anything else that simply wasn't needed anymore was tossed on the lunar surface near the lander. You can see it in a lot of photos. It's weight that could be replaced with more moon rocks, more equipment from a surveyor probe, more experiments. Now, I can feel the environmentalist in some of you wanting to speak up. However, the moon isn't exactly what you'd call hospitable. Trash on Earth is a problem because it harms the environment, the people, the wildlife, the plant life. None of that stuff exists on the moon. It is a barren, lifeless, irradiated rock, much like it would appear a lot of the rest of our solar system, at least on the surface. When we get around to a permanent, sustained lunar presence, we can pick up the trash. We can build the first lunar trash cans around that stuff. Although, to be honest, I think all 6 landing sites should be put under glass domes and left as museum exhibits, trash and all. But we'll see. The Skylab 4 mutiny. Finally, we come back to America's first space station. The urban legend version is a far more interesting story, so let's start there. Skylab 4 was actually the 3rd and final crew to visit the station. Skylab 1 was the station's uncrewed launch, and ran for 84 days in the winter of 1973. According to the story, the astronauts aboard Skylab 3 became dissatisfied with how NASA management was delegating their daily timelines. They were being micromanaged and overworked, and as a result, they staged a strike, or a mutiny. They turned off the space station's radio, took the day off, and did whatever they pleased. However, the truth of the matter isn't as fun. The crew of Skylab 4, Gerald Carr, Edward Gibson, and William Pogue, were somewhat overworked, and had started to get a little fatigued and behind on that work. To make up for it, they made a decision that the daily briefing need only be attended by 1 crew member, leaving the other 2 to continue working. On one of these mornings, Gerald Carr simply forgot to turn on his radio. Skylab was out of contact with mission control for 1 orbit, though they never actually stopped working during this time. By the next planned contact period in orbit, communications had been re-established, and a discussion was held regarding the astronauts' schedules in light of their fatigue. Carr called this discussion, quote, the first sensitivity session in space. There is extensive documentation of the crew's activities during all of the days that the mutiny is alleged to have taken place, negating the claim that it ever did take place. The only source for it, in fact, is a 1980 case study by the Harvard Business School entitled Strike in Space, which stated, quote, on December 27, 1973, the 3rd crew of the Skylab space station turned off the radio and refused to talk to mission control. There was no source for the claim of either the date or the radio being turned off. The authors acknowledged at the end of the piece that much material was drawn from Henry S.F. Cooper's book A House in Space, which expanded on a magazine article and stated the astronauts stopped working and did what they wanted for 1 day halfway through the mission. In truth, on December 27th, the crew did medical tests of their cardiovascular systems using a bicycle, conducted 7.5 hours of observations using the Apollo telescope mount, photographed ground targets in the South Atlantic, Saudi Arabia, and coastal Peru, and broadcast 3 television transmissions, among other things. The only truth to the mutiny was a communications blackout for 90 minutes because Gerald Carr was a little tired and forgot to turn on the radio. Tier 4 complete. We've only just begun to descend into lunar obscurity. Down we go, folks. Yes, I know the Apollo 12 lightning strikes are on a different tier from SCE to Ox. It's just a name, don't think too hard about it. Also, from this point on, the level of obscurity becomes somewhat arbitrary. From here, it's all pretty obscure. Deep space EVAs. When we think of spacewalks, we tend to think of the Earth dominating the background. Alexei Leonov and Ed White on the world's first spacewalks, the many hours of footage from the Space Shuttle or the International Space Station. However, imagine how different it must feel if you're not 400 kilometers away from the Earth, but more like 300,000 kilometers away. The only times in history this feat has ever been performed were, of course, during Project Apollo's 3J missions. On Apollo 15, as the crew was returning to Earth, Alfred Worden suited up and exited the command module at an altitude from Earth of around 317,000 kilometers. Bear in mind, he's not floating free. He has a tether, and he's grasping handles installed specifically for this purpose as he makes his way along the service module. He was given 2 tasks. First, retrieve a set of 2 film cassettes from the service module sim bay. Second, check out the condition of the sim instruments themselves, during which he noted that 2 instruments had failed to fully retract themselves. Not an issue for re-entry, as the entire module is jettisoned from the command module well before that. This entire process took 39 minutes. On Apollo 16, Ken Mattingly performed the second deep space EVA, taking 83 minutes this time. Mattingly also retrieved film cassettes and checked the sim bay instruments, but also set up a biological experiment that examined the effects of exposure to deep space on microbial life forms. Finally, on Apollo 17, Ronald Evans spent 65 minutes outside the CSM, again retrieving the film cassettes, but this time also needing to retrieve another 70mm film cassette from the Lunar sounder experiment, which used high-frequency and very high-frequency pulses to gather data on the moon's subsurface composition. To date, no other spacewalks have ever been performed outside of low Earth orbit. The highest would be, at a guess, any space shuttle missions to deploy or service the Hubble Space Telescope, which is 576 kilometers above the Earth. Ken Mattingly's wedding ring. Ken Mattingly lost his wedding ring on the moon. Don't worry, this story has a happy ending, I promise. Alright, he didn't lose it on the moon. He lost it on the way to the moon, on day 2 of Apollo 16. In 1970, Mattingly married Elizabeth Daly, and the two had a son together in 1972, though I can't find out if this was before or after Apollo 16. The ring Mattingly wore to symbolize that union, at some point on day 2 of the mission, simply came loose and floated off of his finger. He wasn't entirely sure when, nor where it had gone. The command module was searched top to bottom, but nobody could find it. Once the mission was making its return to Earth, Mattingly made one last attempt, searching near the module's air filters where floating objects often wound up getting stuck. However, still no avail. Mattingly concluded, "Well, I guess I lost it," and prepared for his trans-Earth spacewalk. During these spacewalks, a second astronaut would keep watch from the command module's opened hatch, and in this case, that astronaut was Charlie Duke. Duke was taking the film cassettes from Mattingly, and as Mattingly turned to climb back down to the service module, Duke said, "Well, would you look at that?" Mattingly turned back and saw Duke pointing at Mattingly's wedding ring as it floated out into space. Mattingly quickly grabbed it, putting it in his suit pocket to keep it safe until the spacewalk was over, and he kept close track of it from there on out. When Apollo 16 splashed down, it was back on his finger. Skylab Revival. We talked in the last episode about how it was originally hoped that Skylab would last longer than it had by being reboosted back into an appropriate orbit. However, we didn't go much into the details of how that would have been done. By 1974, Skylab had saw its final scheduled flight, a world record-setting 84-day stay by its third crew. After their departure, the station was vented of atmosphere, and the majority of its onboard systems were shut down. It was now dormant, waiting for the next planned phase of its operation. With the Apollo hardware being fully retired, the hope was that Skylab would eventually be reactivated and its decaying orbit boosted by the then-in-development Space Shuttle. After 4 years of complicated struggles to refine the design of the upcoming shuttle, NASA remained hopeful. In 1978, 4 pairs of astronauts began training for orbital flight test shuttle missions, and among them was Apollo 13 veteran Fred Hayes. In the press release announcing the crews, it was stated that one of these OFT flights could be made to boost Skylab into a higher orbit. However, the immensely complex space shuttle was proving slow and difficult to master the design elements of, and in 1977, engineers were predicting its systems would not be ready for a reboost mission until its 5th flight, forcing NASA to greenlight production of hardware that could boost the station by remote control. Introducing the Teleoperator Retrieval System. This goofy little boxy guy could be flown autonomously and be launched aboard the shuttle as soon as its 3rd flight. The crew would deploy it near Skylab, guide it over by remote, dock, and assess the status of the station. If it was no longer fit for crew, the TRS would fire its engine and bring it down into a controlled dive into the atmosphere, where it would break apart over empty ocean. If Skylab could be restored for future use, it would fire its engine in the other direction, inserting it into a higher storage orbit until the shuttle was able to dock with it itself. What really sealed the fate of Skylab in the end was the Space Shuttle main engine. The extremely complicated and all-new engine was rife with troubles, and in 1978, 2 test stand failures pushed its schedule permanently beyond the point of no return. The shuttle was not ready for a 1979 launch, and would in fact not fly until 1981. NASA turned to focusing its efforts on a safe re-entry path for Skylab, with mixed success. Large portions of it ended up falling over Western Australia, which we mentioned in the last video. Skylab Rescue. Staying on the Skylab train for now, Skylab Rescue was the plan to bring home astronauts in the case of an emergency. The groundwork had already been laid. There were previous plans from the Apollo program to use the CSM as a rescue vehicle to save astronauts stranded in lunar orbit. The idea was remarkably simple. The CSM could seat 3 astronauts with storage lockers on the aft bulkhead. So, taking out the lockers provided space for 2 more crew seats, bringing the total to 5. A Skylab rescue mission would launch with a crew of 2 and return with all 5. No rescue mission ever needed to be flown, however, they did come close. Skylab 3, shortly after launch, had a problem with one of its 4 RCS thrusters, causing them to lose control of it. 6 days later, on August 2, 1973, they woke up to see the craft's fuel leaking out of the thruster's nozzles on the opposite side as the other failure. They were down to 2 blocks of nozzles now, though by this time the astronauts were safely aboard Skylab, giving some time to decide what to do. The mission continued while preparations were made for a possible rescue mission by assembling a Saturn 1B and CSM, and even at one point rolling it to the launch pad. However, the mission never ended up being sent. Earlier training had already shown that a CSM was capable of deorbit with not just 2 working thruster blocks, but only 1. Skylab 3 was able to complete its 59-day mission and return to Earth safely, landing on September 25, 1973. The Soviet Soyuz Zond missions. It's a good thing we did just a brief overview of Soviet lunar programs in the first video, because it allows us to now revisit that and dig into some of the details. The Soviet lunar landing plan differed greatly from the American one, looking more like a lot of the proposed architecture for crewed missions to Mars. Rather than bringing everything you need in one launch a la the Saturn V, the Soviet idea was to assemble a lunar vehicle in Earth orbit with multiple launches of their old reliable, the R-7. Part of this program would also involve a stripped-down version of the first-generation Soyuz, the L-1, performing crewed flybys of the moon in preparation for landing. However, after Apollo 8 successfully put humans in orbit of the moon, these crewed flyby missions became low priority, worsened by the fact that the proposed Proton booster was slow to develop and far from being human-rated. In the end, the Zond spacecraft would make 5 flights from Zond 4 to 8, and 4 of these flights suffered serious malfunctions, and even more failed completely before reaching orbit. Zond 4 launched successfully to a high apogee orbit, but failed during re-entry after its guidance system malfunctioned. Zond 5 successfully flew 2 tortoises around the moon, but re-entered at an angle that would have killed any cosmonauts. It also caused a scare in the United States when, on September 19, 1968, the voices of 3 cosmonauts were intercepted by United States listening stations. The cosmonauts were reading out telemetry data and computer readings, and even discussing an attempt to land. For a brief moment, there was real fear that the Soviets were going to beat NASA to the moon. However, after looking further into it, it was realized that the communications weren't coming from the spacecraft, they were coming from the ground being routed through the spacecraft back to Earth. The spacecraft was completely without crew. The cosmonauts had been just playing a prank, and the Americans had fallen for it completely. Zond 6 crashed after a parachute failure, Zond 7 was wholly successful, but Zond 8 lost control during re-entry, and the program was cancelled in 1970. Having lost the race to the moon, political interest dwindled. The Soviets would not be going to the moon today. The Apollo Rickshaw. The proper term for it is the Modular Equipment Transporter, and prior to the lunar roving vehicle, this was what they had. Well, it was what Apollo 14 had. 11 and 12 just had their own gloved hands. The MET was a 2-wheeled, hand-pulled vehicle designed to lug around equipment and samples to and from the lunar module. The astronauts had a lot of equipment with them. Hand tools, cameras, rolls of film, bags to hold rocks, and more. It was used for only one mission, as the rover quickly made it obsolete, though it did beat the rover in having the first tires on the moon courtesy of Goodyear. Astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell didn't care for the rickshaw. At one point they had to pick the whole thing up and carry it together because it was unable to push through the rough terrain of the lunar surface. When it was replaced with the rover, the design called for something heavier and capable of moving farther, so the nitrogen-filled tires of the rickshaw were replaced with a wire mesh design that helped mitigate the dust problem for the rover. Gimbal lock. This is a phenomenon that occurs when a 3-axis system loses 1 degree of freedom, making it behave like a 2-axis system. Imagine you can pitch and you can roll, but you can't yaw. Or you can yaw and you can pitch, but you can't roll. It happens when 2 axes of movement are driven into a parallel configuration, causing changes to one to apply the same change to the other. So how do you fix gimbal lock? Well, the simplest solution is to add a 4th gimbal that can remain independent of the other 3 until one of them becomes locked, then taking its place. However, a 4th gimbal creates extra weight, so NASA decided to get a little clever with it. They instead designed an indicator that would trigger when the guidance was approaching a point where gimbal lock might occur, eventually freezing the entire inertial measurement unit if it got too close. Once this happens, the astronauts would then have to manually realign the system using the stars as a reference point. Both Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 experienced the problem of gimbal lock, and after Neil and Buzz had landed on the moon, Michael Collins up in lunar orbit casually requested a Christmas gift, a 4th gimbal. The Golden Camera Award. Pretty short and sweet for this one. The Golden Camera Award is an annual German film and television award held by the Funk Mediengruppe, Germany's 3rd largest newspaper and magazine publisher. Prior to 1987, the recipients of the award were almost exclusively German, but in 1972, the award was given to NASA's Ed Fendel, head of the Communications Systems section of the Flight Control Division at Johnson Space Center. The carefully timed liftoff of Apollo 17, the 360-degree pans, zooms into the astronaut as they hopped away, that's all Ed. He was the man behind the controls for the Apollo TV cameras, and his work earned him a distinguished award that was usually not given to people outside of Germany. Awesome work, Ed. Lunar motorcycle. Possibly the coolest thing to never happen on the moon. While it's commonly referred to as a possible alternative in case the LRV wasn't ready for Apollo 15, the truth is that the Apollo motorcycle was just one of several ideas evaluated for getting astronauts around on the moon. There's only a few images of these tests showing a very simplistic and squat motorcycle being tested, and some of them might actually be new images, I'm not really sure. The idea wasn't explored very far beyond that, and it's possibly for the best. Consider the extensive amounts of dust being thrown up here by the wheels of the LRV, and imagine the legs of your suit being exposed to those sharp clouds. Probably not the best idea. The Apollo 15 postal covers. Oh boy, this is a big one. In 1972, NASA took a massive hit to its reputation when the astronauts of Apollo 15 got a little greedy. Though I will add that these days, this scandal seems to have more or less been forgotten. From the beginning of the space age, commemorative postage stamps depicting spaceflight and spacecraft and satellites began to be collected by philatelers, that is to say, stamp collectors. Collectors also sought souvenirs through the form of specially designed envelopes called covers, and a particularly valuable postal cover would be one that had flown to space, or even to the moon. There was nothing specifically against the rules in regards to astronauts selling a personal item from a spaceflight, and it had in fact happened in the past, but the crew of Apollo 15 took it a little too far. They made a deal with a German stamp dealer named Hermann Seeger, who offered them each $7,000 to carry 100 postal covers to the moon, adding another 300 covers for their own usage. Again, this isn't illegal or against any rules, but it is somewhat in poor taste. It was said that the crew had turned a scientific operation into a financial one, and they had gone above one specific rule in order to do it. While the astronauts are allowed an amount of personal belongings on board each flight, these belongings had to be recorded and approved by the crew's supervisor, in this case, Mercury veteran Deke Slayton. Slayton, then known for his ironclad grip on the crews he supervised, claimed that he knew about 144 of these covers cleared to be carried by Al Worden, but he had been told it was for personal use, Worden neglecting to mention the deal with Seeger or the rest of the covers. After returning the postal covers to Earth, the astronauts left their personal ones at a Houston printer to certify and hold on to, and then began to plan a trip to Europe. Once they were on their way to Germany to receive their money from Seeger, they learned that Seeger had already sold all of the covers they had given him. At this point, astronaut David Scott stated that they were in trouble. They hadn't planned on the covers getting out into the world so early and so fast, and when they did, it was picked up by American media. A NASA investigation quickly began into what Deke Slayton had called a regular goddamn scandal. It got worse when the astronauts claimed they weren't aware any postal covers were going to be used for commercial purposes. NASA now looked careless and incompetent in the public's eye, completely unaware of what their astronauts were doing and what they were taking up into space. Astronauts in those days were practically celebrities, and the entire operation gave the impression that they were using their prestigious positions purely for profit. All 3 crew members of Apollo 15 were permanently grounded, their reputations tarnished, and the remaining postal covers confiscated. By 1977, the crew had left NASA, and then in 1983, Al Worden received a small amount of justice. NASA was planning to fly 260,000 postal covers on a space shuttle mission, and he consequently sued the US government for confiscating his covers without a hearing. The government was forced to return all of the covers to the astronauts. Launch waste disposal. We've talked already about the bags that were used for waste disposal in flight, and how most of them would end up on the surface of the moon to reduce weight. However, when they were on the launch pad, the situation changed a little. From James R. Hansen's First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong, we rubbed our behinds with a special salve and pulled on what were euphemistically called fecal containment garments. Much like they did when they were in their EVA suits, the Apollo astronauts had to wear diapers, and they had to put on baby powder to keep from chafing, and they basically had to wear a catheter strapped to their hip. The entire thing sounds deeply uncomfortable, and I'm not surprised that astronauts during launches often keep their responses to mission control short and sweet. They're probably doing everything they can to not think about their soiled diapers and catheter tubes. Thankfully, once in space, they were able to take all of this off, clean up, and change into jumpsuits. Much better, though they were still doing their business into bags. Skylab B. Oh, what could have been. We've already talked about the decline and eventual demise of Skylab, and what better to remedy this issue than to simply launch another one? Well, this was considered because there actually was already 2 of them. Built in 1970 by McDonnell Douglas alongside the first one, Skylab B was a backup module that was put in storage while the first one operated and NASA tried to figure out how best to use what hardware they had left from the Apollo program. So, What would you do with Skylab Round 2 Orbital Boogaloo? Well, there were a few options. Let's run through some. One idea was to spin it. For years, the idea of achieving artificial gravity by rotating a spacecraft had been conceptualized, but never put into practice. Skylab B was one way to test the concept, but of course it never came to fruition. Other ideas involved expansion of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, creating an international Skylab serviced by both Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft, or by docking Skylab B with a Soviet Soyuz station. This latter option posed significant challenges primarily around the differences in docking adapters and spacecraft pressurization. The station could even be expanded by the space shuttle once it entered service. However, after the first Skylab module was largely successful on launch, plans for Skylab B were cancelled and it was eventually donated to museums, with its orbital workshop at the National Air and Space Museum, the airlock module at Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum, and its multiple docking adapter at the KSC Visitors Complex. Jim Irwin's near heart attack. There are few places I can imagine more frightening to develop a serious medical condition than while you're orbiting the moon, but that's what happened to Jim Irwin on Apollo 15. After the moonwalking was complete and Irwin had returned to the CSM, he was busy moving rock samples and other items into the command module when the flight surgeons began to notice some irregularities in his heart rhythms. Irwin and David Scott had been working with no sleep for 23 hours at this point, and what the flight surgeons saw were actually the earliest symptoms of a heart condition that would plague Irwin for the rest of his life. As the symptoms worsened, Deputy Director Chris Kraft was told, "It's serious. If he were on Earth, I'd have him in ICU being treated for a heart attack." Though Irwin wasn't directly having a heart attack, his arrhythmia was bad enough that, if he was on Earth, he'd have been at high risk for one. In a stroke of luck, Irwin had actually developed these symptoms in the best possible conditions. He was in zero gravity, reducing strain on his heart muscles, he was breathing 100% oxygen in the cabin, and he was being continuously monitored. In a way, he already was in an ICU. He had little else to do during the rest of the trip home, which gave him the opportunity to relax and recover. His heart rhythm returned to normal all the way to splashdown, though the condition would rear its ugly head later in his life when he suffered 3 major heart attacks. The final one in 1991 would take his life, and he would become the first of the 12 men to walk on the moon to die. Retrograde orbits. It may surprise you to know that every Apollo mission that orbited the moon did so essentially backwards. That is to say, in the opposite direction of the moon's rotation. It may seem counterintuitive, as going with the rotation of a body's spin is used to save some fuel expense caused by fighting against it. The moon, however, rotates very slowly, roughly once every 27 days, and the retrograde orbits were more about going against the orbit of the moon. If they had approached from the other direction, they would effectively slingshot around it and, if no changes were made, accelerate further into deep space. However, approaching retrograde allowed for a free return trajectory, which is a trajectory that will eventually lead back to Earth if no changes were made, or more importantly, no changes could be made. It was all about optimization, and in this particular case, traveling backwards was the optimum path. Where is Snoopy? Snoopy was the nickname given to the LEM for Apollo 10, while the CSM was called Charlie Brown. Snoopy is the only once crewed spacecraft to still be in outer space without a crew. Well, at least half of it. The bottom half, the descent stage, was jettisoned in lunar orbit, and its current location is unknown, though there's really only 2 options. It's either still in orbit of the moon to this day, or the uneven mass distribution of the moon has pulled it down and it has crashed. The ascent stage, however, used its remaining fuel to burn past the moon and into orbit of the sun, the only time an Apollo LEM did so. After the mission was over, Snoopy's ascent stage was not tracked, and it disappeared. Amateur astronomers have spent the following decades trying to locate it, and in 2011, a group of astronomers in the UK started an official project to look for it. After several false alarms, in 2019, the Royal Astronomical Society announced that they had probably found it. A small Earth-crossing object labeled 2018 AV2 is believed to be Snoopy with 98% certainty. Snoopy's still out there, orbiting the sun and occasionally crossing paths with the Earth again. Maybe someday she'll come all the way home. The Apollo 17 LRV fender. Would it surprise you to know that the first automobile on the moon was used only twice before it had a traffic accident? Well, sort of. It didn't crash into anything. John Young crashed into it, accidentally knocking off the rear fender extension on Apollo 16. Then on Apollo 17, it happened again with Gene Cernan when he bumped a fender extension with a hammer handle. Remembering the enormous amount of dust thrown up without the fender to block it on the previous mission, the crew were determined to repair it this time. First, the astronauts attempted to simply tape the fender extension back on, but the sheer amount of dust made getting the tape to stick virtually impossible. So NASA returned to its historic days of Apollo 13 and fixed the problem with duct tape. They constructed a replacement fender out of some EVA maps, duct taped together, and a pair of clamps intended to mount an overhead light that fastened the extension to the rest of the fender. It worked for the duration of the mission, and the work was all undone afterwards, bringing the pieces back to Earth. The maps and duct tape are now on display at the National Air and Space Museum, still with cuts and abrasions from the sharp lunar dust. Sneaker test. How do you test a rocket's ability to withstand things like high winds while it's sitting on the launch pad? Well, you shake it. And how do you do such a thing? Well, in the days of the shuttle, this kind of thing was done with machines and a test stand. However, Apollo had a slightly cheaper and low-tech idea. Push it with your feet. On one side, engineers would group together and shove the side of the rocket with their shoes, hence sneaker test, while engineers on the other side would pull the rocket with a rope. Simple, yet effective. The Bart Sibrel punch. Maybe my favorite thing an Apollo astronaut has ever done while they were on Earth. In 2004, conspiracy theorist Bart Sibrel released a film called Astronauts Gone Wild, an investigation into the authenticity of the moon landings. This was a follow-up to his wildly successful 2001 film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, in which Sibrel lied about receiving secret footage and what it showed. In this follow-up, Sibrel tried to pull a fast one on some of the Apollo astronauts. He made up some false press credentials and stalked and harassed 8 of the astronauts, demanding that each of them swear upon a Bible that he had actually gone to the moon. Most of the astronauts, Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, John Young, and Al Worden, refused his request. 3 of them, Alan Bean, Gene Cernan, and Edgar Mitchell, did as they were asked and swore on the Bible, and Sibrel still claimed they were lying. One of the astronauts, Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr., took it a step further and did what all of the others clearly wanted to do. After he declined Sibrel's demand, he tried to walk away. Sibrel followed him, berating him and continuing his demand. Eventually, he made his biggest mistake. He stood before a veteran of 66 combat missions during the Korean War, and he called that veteran a coward.
Come with me, Buzz.
You really like attention, don't you? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Oh, that's good, isn't it? Let's watch that again.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
A couple more times.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief and a thief and a thief.
Once more. I have watched that clip more times than I can count. Of course, Sibrel tried to have Aldrin charged, however the police declined to press those charges. A 72-year-old war veteran and astronaut just clocked Sibrel in the jaw, and the world said, shame about that. Anyway. Worth noting that several years later, Bart Sibrel was arrested himself for stomping on the hood of a car during a parking dispute. That's the kind of person he is. Saturn V derivatives. Oh boy. We've talked about derivatives before. I highly advise watching the Space Shuttle Iceberg to learn more about how those work, and of course, if you build the most powerful rocket in the world at the time, people are going to have ideas on how to improve or change it. There were a lot of these derivative ideas over the years, though none would ever leave paper and enter the real world. Let's go through just a few of these options. The Saturn shuttle was one of many concepts for launching the Space Shuttle orbiter during its preliminary design days. The idea was to use a Saturn V first stage, the S1C, and replace the second stage, the S2, with the shuttle's external fuel tank, mounting the orbiter on the side of it. The S1C would perform the functions of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, which do the majority of the heavy lifting during the early phases of ascent. The second stage would ignite the shuttle's engines mid-flight, something the Space Shuttle main engine ended up not being capable of actually doing, and finish the ride to orbit. Adding wings and landing gear to the S1C would allow it to fly back to a runway and be reused in addition to the orbiter, leaving the only discarded component, the external tank, much like the finalized shuttle design. However, the proposed design wouldn't be able to reuse the F1 engines, needing to replace them for each flight, which was seen as a major drawback. Another proposed Saturn V derivative was the Saturn V B. Designed to be a smaller but more efficient stage-and-a-half booster, this one works similarly to the Atlas rocket. 5 F1 engines would act as the first stage, and then 4 of the engines and their skirt and mounting hardware would fall away, leaving 1 engine to act as a sustainer and finish the job. The first stage engines could then be recovered via parachutes and reused. These 2 designs are only the tip of what could be another iceberg of designs based around the mighty Saturn V, but I can't go on forever. At least 1 more of these designs will be discussed later in this iceberg, but for now, just know that many ideas existed, and not all of them were good. The MEM, or Mars Excursion Module. With the incredible achievement of landing humans on the moon, there were a lot of people who thought that we weren't going to stop there. Expecting to be able to land humans on Mars by the 1990s, NASA made a number of spacecraft development studies around crewed Mars vehicles, and a popular one was the MEM. Inspired directly by the Apollo Lunar Excursion Module, the MEM was a 2-stage craft that would include a descent stage to land on the surface, a short-stay surface habitat, and an ascent stage that would use the descent stage as a launch pad, just like Apollo. There was also a proposed cargo MEM that would consist of only the descent stage and the habitat turned cargo hold for delivering supplies, rovers, or even a proposed nuclear reactor and expanded living quarters. The design evolved over time as robotic exploration of Mars began, removing a lifting body that the Mariner spacecraft had proved would be ineffective and adopting a more gumdrop-like Apollo design. However, as we all know, crewed missions to Mars have been very sadly pushed to the back burner of spaceflight. One day we will land there, but it's very unlikely that we'll be using this design first conceived in the 1960s. Barbie's Ken on the Moon. This last one is just kind of a space Twitter meme. You see, there's a lot of degeneracy on Twitter. A lot of foolish people. Many of them, anytime the Apollo program is mentioned, rush out of the woodwork frothing at the mouth and desperate to tell everyone about how it's all a hoax. In the first part of this video, I discussed how absurd I find Apollo hoax claims and how easy they are to dismantle, but there's one claim that's become so frequent that it served to discredit the people who believe this kind of stuff before they even speak. Over 60 times now, we have found the claim that behind-the-scenes footage of Apollo 11 has been leaked to the public, proving once and for all that the missions were filmed on a stage. However, that's not Neil Armstrong. That's Ryan Gosling filming the 2018 film First Man. Probably 2 or 3 times a month now, maybe more, we come across this video to a point where there's an entire Twitter account dedicated to counting the number of times this claim has been made. That's how little those who cry hoax actually investigate their claims. They don't even notice the modern clothes, the digital clapboard, or Ryan freaking Gosling staring them in the face. Believe it or not, everyone, we're done for part 2. I assure you, however, that part 3 will be the final part, no matter how long it ends up being. These middle tiers ended up being filled with things that had pretty extensive stories, and I still skimmed over a lot of things. As we descend further and further into obscurity, there will likely be less and less to say about each individual subject, but nevertheless, there are a lot of those subjects left. By the way, I just want to give a huge thank you to everyone watching for 16,000 subscribers at the time of this recording. The recent growth of this channel has been incredible, and I'm excited to bring new and interesting content to all of you in the future. Until next time, everyone.